Hey everybody, welcome to another edition of American Rambler. I am your host, Colin Woodward, and on today's podcast, I don't have a guest, unfortunately. I am using this podcast as a dry run for a talk that I have to give. It is for the Legacies and Lunch series in Little Rock, Arkansas, and the talk is going to be about my book that is upcoming, my book, Country Boy, The Roots of Johnny Cash. And I do remember going to Legacies and Lunch a few times when I was in Little Rock. I'm not sure how often they have it, but it's coming up the first Wednesday of this month at noon. So if you want to check out the actual talk, I think there's, obviously there's a way you can log in the Central Arkansas Library System, CALS. Probably go to their website, check out Legacies and Lunch, and you can watch me live on Wednesday of next week. I'm recording this on Saturday, but it will be on so that is Wednesday the 6th. That's when I'm giving the talk at noon. If you want to watch me live, although since I'm essentially doing the talk here, you can get it whenever you want on this podcast through the miracle of podcasting. Okay, so Country Boy, The Roots of Johnny Cash. This book is coming out, I am grateful to say, in the fall of 2021 through University of Arkansas Press. It has been in the works for a long time. I'm still working on it, still revising, still adding, still subtracting. But it's hard to say exactly when this book began because it started when I was an archivist working at the University of Arkansas Little Rock Center for Arkansas History and Culture. I am a native New Englander. I'm from a small town, at least by New England standards, about 5,000 people. I've been to a few big cities in my life. I certainly haven't seen a lot of the United States the way Johnny Cash did, but I've traveled a little bit and had never been to Arkansas before I had my job interview there. So it was certainly a departure for me to see Little Rock. That's pretty much all I saw when I was there for my interview and presentation and everything. But I took the job in January of 2012 and stayed there for over 3.5 years. I left in August 2015. And in addition to being an archivist, I'm also a historian. So I'm always looking for new things to think about, read about, write about. I was still working on my first book on the Civil War and the Confederate Army and slavery, Marching Masters, when I was in Little Rock. So I was heading toward the end of that process. The book had been accepted for publication, but it took a couple of years. It was published while I was in Arkansas, which was nice. But when I got to Arkansas, I didn't know much about the state. Certainly didn't know a lot about Johnny Cash. I knew his music a bit. I had a 3 CD compilation of his music, which I still love and listen to quite a bit and listened to it a lot while I was writing this book. But when I got to Arkansas, I thought, well, maybe I'll try to write about one of the big Arkansans. And I think I knew that I knew that Johnny Cash had come from Arkansas, but I didn't know a whole lot about his story before I got there. I had seen the film Walk the Line, as so many people did, and I don't want to get into that movie necessarily. I do like the movie. It's got a lot of historical problems, and some people don't like it, but I had seen that movie and I knew the music a bit, but didn't know the whole Cash story. And so when I got there, the thing that really got me started on Johnny Cash was this photo that I found in the Euler archives. And when I got there, part of my job, or a lot of my job, was to sort of rebuild the archive that had been moved from campus to a downtown location, and what was then the Arkansas Studies Institute, since has changed its name. But we were sharing space with CALS, and we had a lot to do in terms of reorganizing our collections. And the biggest collection at Euler is the Winthrop Rockefeller collection, the Governor Rockefeller papers. And in this collection, I had found a couple of Johnny Cash photos and didn't know really anything about when these photos were taken when I saw them, but I knew it was Johnny Cash. And one in particular stuck out. It was Johnny Cash and his wife June and Governor Rockefeller somewhere outdoors on a warm day in a rural location. That's about all I could tell. But it's the three of them talking. And the more I knew about the Rockefeller collection, the more Johnny Cash material I found. There's some really great photographs in there. There were just a couple that had actually been printed out, but there's no identification when they were taken, who took them, why Johnny Cash and Rockefeller were together at any time. Obviously, there's the Arkansas connection between Cash being from Arkansas and Rockefeller being the governor. But beyond that, I didn't really know anything. So as I got used to Arkansas and learned more about the history, I wanted to get deeper into this Cash story. And in the Rockefeller collection, there's all kinds of things. There's a lot of correspondence, financial papers, a lot of photographs, but there's also some great audio, a lot of his speeches. But there was also audio of Cash giving these concerts in 1968 to help Winthrop Rockefeller get re-election. And the more I got into the collection, the more I kind of kept going down these research rabbit holes in terms of Cash doing the concerts for Rockefeller. What was that all about? Cash getting involved in Rockefeller's efforts to reform the prison system. That was very interesting to me. So I could have gone in a bunch of different directions. I could have maybe gone into Rockefeller, gone into the prisons, or gone more into the Cash story. So I decided to focus on Cash and all the things that he was doing in Arkansas. And one of the unfortunate things about Arkansas is that it is a very understudied state. It's got a very interesting history, but usually when people talk about Arkansas, they talk about how poor it is. They talk about maybe that it was in the Confederacy. They might talk about Central High and the Civil Rights story. But other than that, there's a lot of gaps. And it has produced some very big people in American history. I mean, Cash being one of them. In terms of musicians, you got Al Green, you got Charlie Rich, you've got a bunch of blues guys, Conway Twitty, Levon Helm. The list really just goes on and on. And so it's got this great musical tradition, and Cash is a part of that. But I wanted to get more into the story of what does Arkansas tell us about Cash, or what does Cash tell us about Arkansas? And one of the tricky things with Cash is that there's no Johnny Cash archive. There have been a lot of books written about him that are not really steeped in the documentary record. So being a historian that likes paper and likes footnoting things and likes doing the research, I wanted it to be a book that was based on documentation, based on newspaper accounts, written accounts about Cash in newspapers. Cash had written a couple of autobiographies which are helpful, but you have to be kind of skeptical of. There are some really great biographies about Cash and some other great writing about him, but certainly nothing that really delves into the Arkansas story of Cash because of the movie and because of his music. He's kind of become this American icon, this big American figure, not just in country music, but roots music, Americana. Some people don't like using the word country, which I find kind of funny. They like to use Americana, but I don't necessarily equate country with Americana. But Cash kind of crosses all these genres. And in terms of looking at him, I wanted to focus on some things that I think kept him rooted, hence the title of my book, The Roots of Johnny Cash. It's not just about his music, but also about where he grew up and how that informed his music and how that affected his life. And Cash, growing up where he did, it wasn't a typical American story, really. And I mean, I don't know if anyone's story is a typical American story. But it's certainly a Southern story to a degree, but I also think it's kind of a uniquely Arkansas story. And what I really want to do in this book is kind of reclaim Cash for Arkansas. I know he became a fixture in Nashville and he really got his start in Memphis, but he lived, the first 18 years of his life before he goes into the military in Arkansas. So it is a very formative time for him. And the story of his upbringing is also one about the Great Depression, about World War II. And so I wanted to tell all of these other stories as I'm kind of going through the bones of the book is a biography. It's structured as a biography, but I'm really using Arkansas as a way to frame where Cash is at certain points in his life. And so the book is about 8 chapters. As an introduction, there's a conclusion, and I try to kind of bring it full circle, starting with his upbringing. And this was a departure for me because I was trained as a 19th century historian, more so a Civil War historian. And so getting into a 20th century figure and a 20th century musician was certainly a transition for me. But the more I got into it, the more I really liked it. I mean, Cash's music sort of sucks you in, but the story of his upbringing and his whole life is a really compelling one. And some of you know it very well, so I don't want to state the obvious too much. But even when I was in Arkansas, I gave some talks on Cash, and even the fact that Cash was from Arkansas, some people in Little Rock didn't know, and I shouldn't say I was surprised that people didn't know, because I don't like to assume that people know anything about whatever I'm talking about. But to be from Arkansas, and this is an older fellow I'm thinking of in particular, that he didn't know that Cash was from Arkansas, I found interesting. I mean, I think a lot of people don't really know where famous people come from, because they're Americans, so we just need to know they come from the United States. But when I think back of people that I knew growing up, I usually didn't know where they were. Sometimes you did. But I think it's kind of something you can take pride in if you produce someone like Johnny Cash. So Arkansas should certainly take pride in the Cash heritage. And he never disowned Arkansas. I mean, he always loved Arkansas. He wasn't one of those people that just wanted to leave and never come back. And he had a lot of feelings about Arkansas, and they weren't all great. But a lot of his family stayed there. He did like to visit over the years. So even though he does move to Memphis and Nashville and other places, Arkansas is really, again, it keeps him rooted, but is also a place that he has a lot of affection for, and certainly Arkansans had a lot of affection for him. So I begin my story in Kingsland, Arkansas, in Cleveland County, the birthplace of Johnny Cash. It's a place I've only been to once, unfortunately, but I visited there when I was about a year into the project back in 2013. I know there's been talk of doing a museum in Kingsland. I'm not sure how far along that is. But as a historian who, again, couldn't rely on just going to an archive or a couple archives to get everything I need to know about Cash, not that you can usually get everything you need to know about a historical person or event in one place, I wanted to kind of soak up the actual physical ground that Cash walked around, and go to the places that he had lived in, where he grew up, to kind of get a sense of the place. And even though Kingsland isn't that far, I guess, from Little Rock or Dias, these are 3 very distinct places in Arkansas that I knew Little Rock a bit from living there, but Kingsland I didn't know at all, and Dias I didn't know at all. So I wanted to visit these places where Cash had been to understand them a little better. And Cash was born in Kingsland in 1932. This is pretty much at the nadir of the Great Depression. Probably 1933 was the worst year of the Depression, because you have the runs on the banks. The stock market crash happens in 1929, but the Depression goes on and on. It doesn't really even end until World War II, when all the military spending really primes the pump with the economy, and America is able to come out of the Depression just in time to fight this horrendous global war. So the war is good for the economy of the United States, not good in a lot of other ways. But Kingsland is a small town. It's always been pretty small, a few hundred people. I think now it's about 450 people. At least that's the size when I was there. It's a very, Cash called it a wide place in the road. It's Kingsland. It's a small town in a county that doesn't have a lot of people. Rison is the county seat, and Cash would play a concert there in 1976. But Cash doesn't live very long in Kingsland. There's not a lot of jobs there for his dad, Ray, who's sort of an itinerant farmer and laborer who will go from job to job during the Depression. And so Cash is born in this dirt floor shack in Cleveland County. Very humble beginnings, but very fitting for a guy who go on to be a great country musician. So it's a very country birth that Cash has. But thankfully for the family, they're able to take advantage of this program in 1935 that is a government program to build houses and create farmland for people that apply for it in Mississippi County, and more specifically the town of Dyess. Dyess is a town that was created by a government worker named Dyess. The town was named after him. And even though in a lot of ways it's a very humble place, once it finally gets built, they don't have running water, they don't have electricity when they get to Dyess. But in terms of housing, this is the best house that the Cashes have ever had. And Johnny is a little boy. He's 3 years old when they move there. The trip takes 2 days. They're in this truck. And even though the government sponsored this program, nothing is really free there. Cash would later say that he grew up under quote-unquote socialism, but it's not really an experiment in socialism. There are socialistic aspects of it, as there are just about everywhere you live, despite what some people would say. But even though the government kind of gets things moving there, the Cashes have to pay for their house. They have a mortgage. There are some things in town that are owned by the people. There's a co-op, a farmers co-op in town, but the town is really run by a private company, and so they want to be in the black every year, just as all the farmers want to. And so, really, it's a very individualistic enterprise. I mean, Ray Cash has got to be a farmer who can grow cotton and sell it at market and make enough to pay for his house and pay for his expenses and whatever. But for the Cashes and a lot of people that move there, and not all people stay, a lot of people do move after a little while, this is really a step up. And so, we can look back and say, well, this big family of 7 kids and 2 parents are living in this house. It's fairly small. This isn't anything great, but during the Depression, this was an opportunity. So Ray Cash took this opportunity and moved his family up to Mississippi County. And this is where Johnny Cash grows up. I mean, he doesn't remember anything about Kingsland. He's very, very, he's very young when they move, so he shouldn't remember it. But this is where he grows to adulthood. He gets a pretty good education at the school. He finishes high school. He's in student government. He's not a great student, but he's a pretty good student who surprisingly doesn't have great grades in English or history. But he's helping out on the farm. He's doing a lot of fishing, and there are a bunch of family things that are going on while he's there that I don't want to get into, but Ray could be an abusive drunk. His brother Jack gets killed in a sawmill accident, which you see in the movie Walk the Line. And so there are hardships. There's tragedy. Ray Cash was not a very nice guy, especially when he was drinking. And so there's some definite trauma there with Cash growing up. But as the family is trying to make the farm work in the 1930s, by the time World War II comes around, this government is completely stepping away from Dyess. And after World War II, it's really never the same. This sort of yeoman farmer, this Jeffersonian type experiment in making small farms work is really doomed after the war, because things are moving to, America's becoming more industrial after the war, and Dyess isn't really a place you can make a living as a farmer, not a small farmer. And so when Cash graduates from high school, he takes on a few odd jobs that he doesn't like. He never liked cotton farming, nor should he have. I mean, he understood the drudgery of the work. And so he had, even though he's in First Farmers of America when he was a kid, there's just no way he's going to become a farmer. He loves music. The whole time he's in Dice, he's listening to things on the radio. He's hanging out with friends in Dice that can play a little guitar or know songs. So he's really absorbing this music in a way that'll later allow him to become this human jukebox that knew thousands of songs. So he's listening to the Grand Ole Opry. He's listening to pop music, not just country, because radio stations weren't specialized the way they are now. So you would hear kind of a little bit of everything. He's going to the movies where he's hearing more music, and he's seeing guys like Gene Autry and Jimmy Rogers on the big screen. So he's really sucking up all this pop culture that he's eventually going to funnel into his music and his albums later. But he spends 4 years in the Air Force, which, Cash wasn't an especially inspired soldier. He kind of did his job when he was over in Germany. But again, just like cotton farming, military was not a future for him. It was something he did to get out of the cotton fields, get a steady paycheck, see a bit of the world. And so he is in Germany, very far from the Korean War, which is going on. He's learning Morse code, and then he works as a translator essentially for the Morse code that's coming through. So he does his job when he's in the Air Force, and he learns again more music. He starts playing in a band. But when he comes back, even though he's not a great guitar player, he bought a cheap guitar when he was in Germany. When he comes back, he absolutely wants to devote himself to music. And he's also very much a Cold War kind of guy. When he comes back, one of the first things he does is he gets married. And when he first moves to Memphis, he becomes an appliance salesman, which not something Cash really was good at. Really kind of the only thing he's good at as an adult in terms of a profession is playing music. But he tries his hand as an appliance salesman, and even though he was honest, he wasn't very good at it. And so in Memphis, I won't get into this story, but he auditions for Sam Phillips at Sun Records. And within about a year of Cash getting back into the United States, he's making music. And it's a pretty amazing thing to see, because nowadays I think it's safe to say it's much, much harder to make it in the music business. But something happened in Memphis that I think it's almost at a supernatural level, that you have Elvis, Johnny Cash, Roy Orbison, Jerry Lee Lewis, Sonny Burgess, all Carl Perkins, all these amazingly talented musicians that are converging on Memphis at once. All these guys who are just immensely talented, and most of whom are good songwriters. I mean, Cash was a great songwriter. Elvis didn't write his own songs, but obviously he's a great entertainer and a great musician. But Roy Orbison, great songwriter. Carl Perkins. So all of these things are happening in Memphis by the mid-50s. Cash is really central to that, and probably the most country of those guys, although Cash is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he had a lot of influence on country music. Rock and roll music. He's certainly steeped in country, Hank Williams and Hank Snow and all those country guys that he grew up listening to. But he has a very kind of stripped down sound. It's just him and two other guys, Marshall Grant and Luther Perkins. So it's Cash and the Tennessee Two that make all that great early Johnny Cash music. They don't even have a drummer until 1960, so a couple of years there. It's just the three of them. And a lot of this music is based on what Cash had been hearing while he was in Dice. One of his first songs is appropriately titled Country Boy. It's on his first album. It really kind of encapsulates this sort of romanticized view of being a country boy. He doesn't refer to Arkansas, but obviously it's based on that. And so there's this great explosion of music coming out of Memphis. And so in the book, after dealing with Cash and Dias and in the Air Force, I deal with the Memphis period where he's using all these things that he learned as a kid in Arkansas, and playing a lot of early dates in Arkansas. Cash isn't going on planes yet. He's getting in the car. They're loading up their instruments, driving from gig to gig all over Arkansas, Mississippi, Tennessee, Louisiana, beyond, kind of doing this deep South circuit for a while. Cash is playing with Elvis. He's playing with people like Charlie Feathers at certain gigs. So it's really, again, all these guys are playing together. They're seeing each other at places in Arkansas that aren't really there anymore, like the Silver Moon Cafe and going down to Texarkana and through Little Rock and everything. So they're playing all over Arkansas. So I try to flesh out as much as I can about those Arkansas gigs, but it's kind of hard because there's not a lot that was written up at that time, because he's becoming Johnny Cash, and so Elvis is the headliner. Further down you'd see Cash, so it's a pretty great bill of music. I mean, it's amazing that you could see Elvis and Johnny Cash in the same concert for $1 back in the 56 or whatever. But he's getting his chops as a live performer, and he's only in Memphis for a couple of years. Eventually he sets his sight on Arkansas. He leaves Sun Records. He leaves Sam Phillips. It was in kind of a sad breakup there. That wasn't great. But Cash moves on to Columbia, where he will have more freedom as an artist. And so even though the Sun period Cash material is great, he's going to start getting into more complex themes, doing essentially concept albums in the early, well, even to a certain degree in the late 50s and early 60s. He's doing songs that are blending, again, all these genres: folk, country, a little bit of rock and roll. And one of his earlier albums that really kind of encapsulates this Americana in his music is Songs of Our Soil, which comes out in 1959. This is the one that has the song 5 Feet High and Rising, which is based on the 1937 flood in Dias, where the family had to leave as the floodwaters are rising and move down. They go down to Kingsland for a little while until the water recedes. And this is a story Cash told again and again at concerts. He'd write about it later in his autobiography. And this, in 2 minutes, he's able to tell this story about the flood. So that's kind of one of the highlights of that album. And it's kind of early, really rootsy music that is talking about Arkansas, not explicitly, but certainly anyone that knew the Cash story then or now knows it's about Dias in that 37 flood. So as Cash moves out of Memphis and out of Sun, he knows how to write great songs that can reach a wide audience and sell a lot of records, but he's getting kind of more into the American story and the story of his own life once he leaves. In the early 60s, Cash is in California. He moved out there to become a movie star and to be on TV. That never really works out, but Cash does settle in California for a few years. It's not a happy time for his marriage. It's not a happy time for his family. Cash has daughters by this time. He's away from his wife for long periods. And so his wife Vivian's kind of stuck on this mountainside mansion with snakes and scorpions running around the yard, with having to take care of these kids while Johnny's gone for weeks, months at a time. And obviously that's not good for the marriage. The marriage starts kind of breaking apart as Cash is getting more into the drugs. And so on the one hand, there's the story of kind of all the pressures on Cash really kind of grinding him down and making him crazy and self-destructive. And, my thesis essentially is, well, the further Cash kind of gets from Arkansas, the worse things get for him in a lot of ways. And California is a great example of that. Cash is still doing great music, but he's kind of uprooted himself and his family. And even though he's in kind of the dry, dusty, hot part of California, but it's definitely not Arkansas. Cash tries to transplant some cotton. He has cotton growing in the front yard for at one point when he's in Casita Springs to sort of stay rooted and keep that keep that continuity between his upbringing and where he's at. But this is just a real gesture. He's really becoming unhinged, and everything is kind of falling apart for him by the mid to late 60s. But again, Cash is making some really great records. Bitter Tears, 1964, is his album about Native Americans that is really trend-setting in a lot of ways. No one's writing about Native Americans in 1964 the way Cash is, and you can kind of put this in the folk category, I guess. It's a very kind of stripped-down record in a lot of ways, but Cash, again, he's telling this story about America. He's telling this story about oppressed people, and it's just not coming out of nowhere. It's based on the fact that Cash knows American history. He grew up in an area that had a very long Native American history. Mississippi County, Kingsland, where he was from originally, also had a very vibrant Native American culture for a while until the whites forced them out. But Cash knew all this stuff growing up, and one of his favorite books growing up was a book called Lone Bull's Mistake, which was written by a white guy, but it's about a Native American who kind of gets everything wrong and gets into a lot of trouble the way Cash was by the mid-60s. But Johnny certainly appreciated the story, and he also thought he had a Native American ancestry, which might have contributed to his desire to write about Native Americans and also defend them from attacks. Later, we'd find out that was not true. He did not have Native American ancestry, but Cash was always very empathetic. So Cash is kind of, he's really split in two in the 1960s. He's doing great music on the one hand, but his personal life is a disaster, and he doesn't really pull out of this disaster mode until 1968, where his creative path and his personal path really converge in a good way. He marries June. 1968 is a huge year for Cash, his biggest year of his life, I would say, once he gets started. Because it's the year he marries June Carter. It's the year he does that Folsom Prison. And it's the year where he's more sober than he had been in a long time. He hasn't totally kicked the drugs yet, and he never really would, but he had cleaned himself quite a bit. He does great at Folsom. The album is huge, and Cash can pretty much do anything he wants in 1968. And Cash uses this comeback period to reorient himself with Arkansas. I mean, he would go back occasionally, but when he was really messed up, he didn't go back so much, and he's busy and he's got all these problems, so he's not going back the way he should have in the early and mid 60s. But 1968, Cash goes to Dyess for a concert that was put together by Gene Williams, who's a music promoter from that area, eventually settled in Branson, Missouri, and had a show. So Gene Williams helps put this concert together. Obviously, it's Cash's hometown. He does a couple shows there. And this is a part of Cash's big year in Arkansas. He does the homecoming show, but in the summer and into the fall, he does a handful of concerts for Winthrop Rockefeller. Rockefeller's running for re-election. He's got a tough fight. He's done some good things in his first term, but the prisons are kind of front page news more or less every day because of the scandals involving Tom Merton and the digging up the skeletons at Cummins and all this stuff. So 68's a big year for Cash. It's also a big year for Arkansas and Rockefeller. Rockefeller's trying really hard. He's a Republican, first Republican since Reconstruction, and he's trying to get reelected against a Democrat who's got a not so great racial past and sorts of things that he said, and it's kind of the old guard Democratic Party still in Arkansas. So WR has a tough fight. He brings in Cash, who plays huge concerts. He's playing kind of, just not quite, but, the various corners of Arkansas, spreading things around geographically. And one of the great stories in all this research with Cash is him meeting Bob Wooten in Fayetteville in September 68, when Wooten went there. He's a fan. He had been in Oklahoma. He's playing gigs and stuff. He knew Cash's songs backwards and forwards. He's a huge fan. He hears about the show in Fayetteville, so he drives up. And just through pure happenstance, a couple of the members of Cash's band, Luther Perkins is dead by this point, but Carl Perkins had been filling in on guitar. He and Marshall Grant, the bass player, are held up by bad weather, and Cash pretty much just pulls someone out of the crowd to play songs with him, because otherwise it's just him and a drummer. June's helping out, but she doesn't play electric guitar. So Bob Wooten is there in the front row. Cash pulls him up on stage, and Wooten proceeds to play these songs pretty much just as Luther Perkins would have done, or about as close as you could expect a stranger in a crowd to do, and Cash is just blown away. So Cash picks up Bob Wooten in the fall, or I should say late summer. It's very late summer, 68. And Bob Wooten stays and plays with Cash for the next 20 years as his guitar. So that story alone really kind of made this book worthwhile. So again, it's all these little rabbit holes, these little biographies that you can weave into a larger biography is kind of what I wanted to do. Not just talk about Cash, but about the band and the fans and everything else. But these Cash concerts are very good for Rockefeller. Rockefeller wins. He's got another term. Cash and Rockefeller meet again at Cummins prison in April of 1969. This is really kind of the high point of Rockefeller's reform efforts, because after this, things are going to start to get very complicated, shall we say. But this is the only time Cash played for inmates in Arkansas. He plays for the men and women at Cummins, which was the biggest prison at the time. And this concert was recorded. It was supposed to be on Cash's TV show, which aired later that year. It did get an airing around Arkansas, but it was never officially released. So you kind of have to dig around on YouTube and know a guy who knows the guy to see that whatever's left of the concert, maybe 25 minutes or so. But this is a very nice occasion where Cash is able to do some good, at least from a PR point of view. He gives some money to the construction of a chapel at Cummins. So he's able to do a little good. He gives a good show for the prisoners. It's a very memorable occasion. But Rockefeller is still up against all of these problems that the prisons have. And Cash never comes back to do another prison concert. And as great a day as it was, in 1970, the prison systems are declared unconstitutional, and in 1970, Rockefeller is not reelected. So obviously there's still a lot of problems there that Cash and WR could only do so much. But at least at the Cummins concert, it was kind of a nice way for them to be promoting reform and doing it in a way that's really kind of historic. And 1969, Johnny Cash gets his TV show that runs for a couple years. It's a variety show. It's very successful, but kind of draining on Cash. So again, by the 70s, even though his career's doing really well, it's kind of hard for him to get back a lot to Arkansas, although he does better than he had in the 60s when he was so messed up. He tries to kind of be a better family man, be a better Christian, visit Arkansas more, but the Cummins concert is such a major event. It's going to be a while before Cash can even try to top that in terms of publicity and how memorable it is. But, he's doing things like state fair shows. He comes back for family reunions in Cleveland County. But the next really big concert that he does in Arkansas is in Cleveland County in 1976. This is during the bicentennial. America's very worked up about being 200 years old, and Cash gives the biggest show that he would ever give in his home county. He visits Kingsland that day. He does the show at the Rison football field, and Cash called it one of the best days of his life, because it wasn't just about him. It was really kind of a family affair. His family's there, Ray's there. Ray gets the key to the city at one point. So it's kind of a trip down memory lane. Obviously, Cash didn't really have many memories growing up in Kingsland, but he had been back and he had family that was still there. So it's very kind of nostalgic moment for him. Day goes very well, threatens rain, but it doesn't rain. Cash goes on a train starting in Kingsland that goes into Rison. So he does this little train trip. He does an interview with Geraldo Rivera, and then he gets out. There's a parade, and then he gives his show and kind of plays his hits. But he also plays this song "Riding on the Cotton Belt," which he wrote just for that occasion and would come out later on an album, which is about his dad and his experiences in Kingsland. So at this point, Cash, he had a number one hit record, 1976, One Piece at a Time. So his career's still going pretty well. He's still clean from the drugs, and it's this big celebration for America that takes place all year. So it's kind of, again, one of the highlights of Cash's life is something that takes place in Arkansas. But again, as Cash's personal life starts to go down the tubes a bit, he's not doing as many shows in Arkansas. They're all that memorable. There's one he does in Pine Bluff in the late 70s, and he's the subject of a roast in Little Rock in 1983. Governor Frank White is there and telling jokes, and this is kind of nice, but not on par with the 68 concerts or the Cummins concert, but Cash is at least trying to come back and honor his home state, and of course people still love him in Arkansas. He has a side project called the Highwaymen, which has aged pretty well. You still hear their music on the radio. It's Cash and Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson, Chris Christopherson. So even though the 80s is not a great time for Cash's own music, the Highwaymen, which is his country supergroup, has a pretty good following. Cash plays the show in 1990 in Little Rock that goes pretty well. And sadly, the last show that Cash ever plays in Arkansas is in Kingsland in 1994. Again, family occasion. Cash's parents are dead by this point, but June is there. His brother Tommy Cash, who's also a country star, is there. John Carter Cash, Cash's son, who's very grown up by this point, is there too. And this is a smaller concert than the one in Rison in 76, but there's still really good turnout. It takes place under a tent this very nice March day. Cash doesn't do a lot of songs. There's a local pickup band that he uses. He just does a few tunes and, shakes hands and greets people and stuff. But this is for the dedication of a Cash cancellation stamp for the post office. So, not exactly a huge... it's not like when he goes to the Kennedy Center to get an honor there. But, for Cleveland County, this is a big deal. Cash coming back. And 94 is a major year for Cash because this is one of his big comebacks. He does this show in Kingsland in March, and I think it's the next month, April of 94, he releases American Recordings, which is Cash's back to basics, a all acoustic album of him doing other people's songs. I'm trying to think. I can't remember if he does his own on that one, but there's certainly it's a usual kind of mix of influences that might all sound like Cash, but isn't necessarily. And this album was produced by Rick Rubin, who would go on to produce a bunch of albums with Cash, 6 altogether. Not all released when Cash was alive, but Cash starts this really phenomenal series of albums where he's, again, bringing in all these things that he'd worked on in his life, the folk, the rock and roll, the country, obviously, the gospel influences. So Cash is kind of dumping everything he's ever done or represented into this series of albums. And so sometimes it's a mixed bag, but critics love these albums. They sell better than anything Cash had done in a long time. And so everything really kind of comes full circle by the mid-90s for Cash. He does the Kingsland show as his last Arkansas concert. He probably didn't plan it. I don't think he planned it that way, but that's what it would turn out to be. He would come back to Arkansas, but that was the last performance in the state of note. As far as I know, I don't think he did anything for a big audience after 94. So it comes full circle. Born in Kingsland, last show in Arkansas is in Kingsland in 94, when he's making this huge musical comeback. Now, some people, they love the early stuff and American American recordings might leave them cold. I mean, I personally really like this. I think it's a great way for him to end his career with this yet another comeback. But again, with all these musical influences taking place, and he's backed by Tom Petty and the Heartbreakers and doing all kinds of new songs that he'd never done before. Doing Beatles covers and Simon and Garfunkel and all these people that he's taking a chance on because Rubin wants him to do something different. And Cash figures, well, I could do that. And, some of it works, some of it doesn't, but I think it's a really great way for him to end his career. All right. Well, to wrap up, again, bring my story full circle because I'm talking about all these things as I go along, trying to bring Arkansas back into the center frame as much as I can throughout the book. But how it ends is, again, kind of how it all begins. It was with the Cash house in Dyess. Now, this house, the Cash family farm, the family had left in the early 1950s. They'd moved to another house in the center of town, but the original farmhouse had been really left to rot for a long period of time, had been occupied for a while. If you look at pictures from the early 70s, it still kind of looks like the original house, but by the early 2000s, it was really bad shape. It had been added to. It was really just kind of collapsing in on itself. The paint was coming off. And so a lot of ways unrecognizable other than the fact that people knew it was Johnny Cash's house and people would still visit, but it was in pretty rough shape. So Arkansas State, as they had done with other houses, they began revitalizing the Cash house in the 20-teens. It's finished in 2014. You can visit the house now, restored to its really original look. The fixtures inside, some of our original, the piano that Carrie Cash played is in there. And so going into it is really a legitimate time machine. I mean, you really are going back in time in every sense of the word, other than literally. But it's a very authentic, and that's a very important word with Cash and his fans. Usually, it's a very authentic experience. The landscape doesn't really look like it would have at Cash's time. It was more of a jungle with a lot more trees. Cash had this fear of forest fires growing up that doesn't make any sense when you look at it now because it's just flat farmland, cottonland. But the house itself is really terrific. And so ASU is able to bring back this house and kind of create a Tupelo for northeastern Arkansas. Cash, had his Graceland in Tennessee when he was living in Hendersonville, this big mansion that he bought when he was rich and famous. But that burned down. So the Cash house in Dyess is the only early Cash house that still exists. The house he was born in has been gone a long time, but the Dyess house is in 1935 condition, and they really did an amazing piece of work there. So obviously, I can only do so much as a historian to make this story known to people, but bringing Cash back for Arkansas. He's not buried in Arkansas, unfortunately. He's buried outside of Nashville. But I really kind of think Johnny Cash's soul is in Arkansas. And if you go to that house, you will feel that way. And they've done some things in the center of town, too, at the administration building and the old theater that they rebuilt. So if you're a Cash fan, you absolutely have to go to see Dyess and walk those grounds. And, I'm hoping that this is just creating a snowball effect with Cash. I know there's a Johnny Cash Museum in Nashville, which I've seen. His farm in Tennessee is still being maintained. So, there are pockets of Cash in Tennessee, of course. But I think the Arkansas experience really adds a major understanding to Cash. And I'm glad that ASU could do that work. And Ruth Hawkins should be congratulated. And she was very helpful with me with this book. So in the last chapter, I kind of want to bring it full circle. I'm talking not just about the Cash house, but kind of how Mississippi County has faced so many challenges since the farming changed, and people had to find work. So this is hopefully a very current story. I want to be true to the Cash story, obviously, but also kind of talk not just about him, but the state of Arkansas in America, and also the state of small towns in America right now, because again, where I grew up, a small post-industrial town, has seen really hard times in the last 40, 50 years or so. The jobs left, and so there's not a whole lot to do, and there aren't really any jobs. And what I experienced growing up in Massachusetts versus what Johnny did in Dias, obviously is very different. But I think if you're from a small town in America, or even if you're not, you will see a lot of things here in this book that you can relate to. And I'm not expecting to have this sell in the way that At Folsom Prison sold, or any of Cash's huge successes sold. But for academic books, I hope it does all right, and I hope that you will buy it and read it. Thank you.